So yeah, I try to self-regulate to find light in the darkness. And yeah, somewhere in between, there lies hope.
Yeah. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. When you find yourself in the middle of the business as usual environment, how can we introduce people to deep adaptation and climate action with rapport and humor? Let's ask that of our guest today, Shu Liang. Welcome to yet another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am delighted to have finally gotten lassoed a fellow workshop participant from last year in 2019 in June. I had the privilege of being able to go from here in Southern Oregon to on the coast in Greece to a little village and even smaller conference center, hotel kind of place, and got to be with Jim Bendel and Katie Carr as they crafted and delivered their first full-length version of a introduction to the work of Deep Adaptation. There were a number of us there, I want to say approximately 20, and Shu Liang is one of those people. And I've got to say that there was a pretty diverse crowd. I'm very pleased at the relative diversity, because it tends to be pretty white, and while there's quite a few women, it's often men, and it's often men of a certain age, and we all know how that's been going. But in this workshop, I was so pleased that there were people of a number of different ethnic backgrounds, people from different countries, people from different walks of life, and people from different professional orientations. And there was just something really delightful and contagiously enthusiastic and engaged about you, Shu. And so I'm so pleased that you're here, that you've taken me up on the invitation to speak on the Poetry of Predicament. And I'm particularly pleased because it's unfortunately a bit rare on the podcast that I get folks who are involved in any sort of engaged way, deeper engagement with deep adaptation. I do have that opportunity in the Deep Adaptation Forum. I lead occasional conversations, Q&A conversations with thought leaders in one of the subgroups there on the forum. What I'm excited about with you, Shu, is you do come from a very different background than I do. You work in a far more corporate environment than I do anymore. I used to do quite a bit of that, and I'm a bit fascinated by finding any sort of positive attributes and any sort of positive conversations in the corporate realm. I'm very interested to speak with people like yourself who are doing your best to bridge the otherwise very stuck, in my judgment, corporate domain into something more fluid, something that is authentically more positively engaged in a very troubled world.
Right.
But before we get to all that, Shu, and by the way, thank you for sitting through all this. I wanted to give people a sense of the context of how we knew each other, and a little bit about what I understand to be your background. So I'm looking forward to you filling in the gaps on that in just a little while. But I'd like to start on a more personal note. And how I'd like to do that is just let you know a couple things that seem really unique about deep adaptation. It drew me to that workshop. You know, it takes a lot for me to come all the way over from the States and spend the money and the time and blah, blah, blah. And
Sure.
I think all of us had something that hooked us. Like we knew this would be a good thing for our particular orientation in the world and so on. One of the pieces that really was significant enough to have me be as engaged as I continue to be with deep adaptation is Professor Bendel's honesty and boldness by including the term collapse. And he, from the beginning, was asserting that we are in the first stages of collapse now. And of course, the bulk of his message is that we have much more coming, and it will be significant, to be diplomatic in my terms. And I consider that a bold act in this world, especially in the academic world. I remember speaking in a particular session one evening early on, and I said that this is an act of power in my parlance, and you know, because he risking it all, as he states in his paper, he risks it all by really showing how the emperor has no clothes. We are not sustainable, and what possible use is there of leadership, sustainability leadership, in an unsustainable world? Right. So that's what drew me. There was that boldness, the power of that truth, speaking truth to power. I'm hungry for that. And I believe that there are many of us who are collapse aware who are hungry for that. But I'm curious if you first would add whatever you might like to add in terms of how you'd like to be known at the level of an introduction that I left out. Okay. Which I left out everything, so it gives you some room. And then if you would, you know, follow up whatever you'd like to add in terms of an introduction, if you would flow for a moment into what drew you to this conversation of deep adaptation. And Shu, it's really great to have you here.
Thanks very much, Dean. Thank you for inviting me. And by the way, I love the name, Poetry of Predicament. I think there's something beautiful about the process we're going through in terms of how we approach the subject of climate change. The sheer magnitude of the challenge in itself is both terrifying and beautiful in a way. So I think your title, the podcast title, really captures that. I loved your introduction. I think nobody has given me that full or completed introduction. Maybe I'll use that for my autobiography. But what I would like to add, well, let's see. So first off, in case you cannot tell, I am, yes, I come from a different background. I am Chinese, born and raised in China. I'm also Canadian. I lived in Canada since I was 18. But I am calling in today from the Netherlands. So in The Hague, Netherlands, where I live now with my husband. You know, this has given me quite a rich experience to take me where I am today. But on the other hand, just like all things, there's the positive side of the experience, but also I'm also becoming acutely aware of my own carbon footprint in terms of all these places I've traveled and lived, reallocated to. That's simply there's price tag to it, and I think that's really what it comes to why I was drawn into climate change work. So just to give a little bit of background, I got my undergraduate study in Canada first, and then my master's study was in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. That was in Sweden. The reason why I went from my undergraduate study, which is in IT project management, to something to the effect of climate adaptation, was in a way similar to my experience, just realizing that what we knew at the time, rich travel experience or living in different country experience, has that truthful side to it. The truth is that there is a cost to it. And I think this is my way of catching up to what I wasn't aware of, and I feel that I needed to contribute to as a person. So ever since, the reason why I was hooked into deep adaptation work, the hook, I think what I'll mention is that since my master's study in Sweden, I came here to the Netherlands, and after working for a international high-level NGO for a year, I realized, and that was in climate adaptation work, I realized when I was reading Professor Bendel's paper, there was something that clicked with me, and that is the effort we have been putting in has not quite addressed the truth of the predicament that we're in, and that is the near collapse or the collapse that we're heading into or already part of. You know, there are different interpretations of that, but simply using the word collapse, that was, as you mentioned, an act of power. I was drawn to that because I think it's something that maybe in the back of my mind as a climate professional, that I was already thinking there's more to this narrative than the just simply cutting down emission narrative that we're talking about, or even adapt to the impact of climate change. How bad is it? You know, we're not really talking about that extensively. Mm-hmm. So when I read the paper, that's where I realized I need to get to know more about this discourse. And I met Jem for the first time in end of 2018, and then that's when I shared my idea on sort of the stichting, the foundation Deep Adaptation with him. We'll get to that in a bit, what his reaction was, but that conversation was enough to build the confidence and trust for me to want to learn more and develop that network further. Mm-hmm. So when this workshop or the retreat came up, I thought I booked it back in January because I wanted a reward for myself in this journey in June. So that was my reward. That was my gift to myself. Very generous, wasn't it? Looking back. It was indeed very rewarding. Like you mentioned, I was impressed with the caliber and the mix of participants that we had. It really opened my mind and heart, right? The emotional acceptance to the deep adaptation discourse was very much in the heart of it. And that was already almost 9 months ago or something like that. So I can't believe time flies by, and now we're here. I'm happy that we both are actively involved with deep adaptation, and happy to be here with you to chat more about any or everything and anything.
All right.
Yes.
Well, is it too early to have you tell us a little bit about what it is you do now?
No, happy to share that. Okay, so let's start with I, before we go to we. So I'm based here in the Netherlands since end of 2018. So same time window as when I met Jem. Mm-hmm. Surprise! I jumped into this deep end that I had no idea back then, but basically founded a stichting, and that's a non-profit, not-for-profit organization here in the Netherlands. It's called Day of Adaptation. And since then, so it's been about a year and 3 months. I have been working with some wonderful colleagues to develop, to build our foundation. The mission, so the name is Day of Adaptation. Day, recognizing the time aspect of our effort. We start with all things, just there's a Chinese saying, long journey starts with one step. Mm-hmm. So in our effort in going even deep adaptation, we still start with a day, for example, and that's where the name come in. Our mission is to empower people and organizations to understand, accept, and commit to climate action. So if you recognize in the name, in the mission, so our focus is actually at the level of people and organizations, so more of the local level. And I can get to discuss more in terms of why we choose to work with people and organizations in a bit. What I do want to mention is we are fun. We are different. Our approach is unique. We call ourselves the cheerleaders for climate action. Mm-hmm. This is very hard for me to accept because I'm Chinese. I mean, fun is not exactly to my nature. Mm-hmm. Even I'm sitting here, I'm feeling a bit awkward, but it's okay. I'll manage. But my colleagues and I recognize that our climate engagement, we simply think we can use more positivity, mm-hmm. more fun. We want to try different ways, maybe introducing the idea of pluralism, having different ways to engage people and organizations. And we have two initiatives. One is called Dialogue Day and the other one is called Game Day. Both are team building activities where people, in a Dialogue Day, participants would be superheroes of climate action. And in the Game Day, which is a board game, participants actually play collaboratively in this board game, with this board game to learn about climate change and have fun while doing it. So in a nutshell, this is what I'm doing. I want to say 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but that's not enough. That's not enough. No, but really enjoying the process. Like I said, just over a year, and we've made tremendous progress already. Just touch on the impact we're making. So last year 2019 was really our first year where we started even just develop the initiatives. We've had, I think, 10 events last year, including dialogue days and a game day. And the results were really positive. People walked away feeling like what I remember one participant said, like first time he actually left feeling his heart was lighter. Mm-hmm. That was really positive to hear.
Got it.
Yeah.
Let me pause you there because I, at the very beginning of your description of your work, mm-hmm. you mentioned, I believe it was 3 words that ended with the sentence to commit to climate action. I believe it was understand and then something else and then
accept and commit to climate action.
It's the accept part that I didn't get. Thank you.
Right.
So there are a number of pieces in there that I'm curious about. Is it okay if we spend a little time with that?
Yes.
So let me just give you full disclosure. I did put in quite a number of years in stand-up corporate training environments and some executive coaching and so on. And I came out of it extraordinarily cynical. Long before I found out about abrupt anthropogenic climate chaos, I knew we were doing very bad things to the planet.
Right.
And I knew that my training work with these companies was doing nothing more than selling more widgets, causing more destruction. So that's for me to work out. I'll get as little of that energy into this conversation as I possibly can. So I'm not at all trying to hold you to any of my standards with that stuff. And it's it's my own process. I own it. But I still have what I think are fair questions to ask, given what we're all facing. I'm curious how it goes and really to what depth you go as you introduce people into this environment of understanding, accepting, and committing to climate action. How's it going for people to understand and accept what's going on? And can you give us a sense of how you map out that territory for people? What, are you using terms similar to Jem Bendel's from his Deep Adaptation paper? Are there other terms? Are there other ways of describing what's going on that you use that are different from that?
Wonderful. And that ties back to your earlier question about how to unpack the positive attributes in corporations, as you put it. So one thing before I start, I want to clarify is that there's a difference with organizations and corporates or companies.
Got it.
Our events last year. So let's just think it through. We've had events at another nonprofit, a municipality, a university, and this year another university and a company. So I guess the part I can speak to is more like what I'm trying to say is we really work with all organizations. We're very inclusive in that sense, as long as they recognize the need to address this topic. Because since you mentioned working with different organizations or corporations, not all companies are the same. They have different approach to it. I think that's one thing I want to highlight. And in terms of our approach, maybe I can share our approach a little bit. Or our philosophy. So my colleagues and I, what we discussed was what we try to do is we try to bring priority, relevancy, balance, and neutrality to the conversation. That is that may be quite a different approach than some of the mainstream communication we're seeing. The reason for that is we really want to meet the participants and organizations where they are.
Yep.
Again, using that 10,000 mile analogy, if deep adaptation is where we want them to head to eventually, you know, we still have to come back to where they are now. How do we communicate with people and organizations? And this has been a very revealing experience or challenging experience for me personally, because prior to starting Foundation Day of Adaptation, I myself, I realize now that I've been in a bubble when I was working in the high-level organizations. We do need to talk more with people outside of the climate change community, and that's what made me realize, in order to communicate with them, we have to be very aware of the language we use. So to give you the short answer is, I mean, I'm happy to say that we take a different approach. So do we use some of the language from Deep Adaptation? No, probably not, because not everyone is ready for that. We want to apply information in a way that's most relevant for people and organizations that we're interacting with now. So in that sense, every organization is even different in terms of what content. We have a general process outline of what we want to talk about. But prior to our activities, we actually meet with the director or the responsible person, point of contact, to understand how they would like us to frame the conversation. So if, for example, with one of the organizations, when we met them, they were very honest. They didn't even have a sustainability policy in the organization. And this is one I thought there would be, for sure, in my head. I mean, just
right.
Come on. But then they didn't have one. So I think, and that I found that surprising. But then, hey, you know what? You got to accept what you have where they are, because just like people, organizations can really sense it as well. If you come in with this preconceived ideas, then I'm sorry, the communication won't happen. So accept that first, and then talk about where we want to land in the conversation. They were very clear. They don't want to talk about organizational level action. They want to talk about personal level action, even though the setting is within an organization. So I said, okay, great. So what happened was, during that session, we focused on personal level. And then towards the end of that an hour and a half, at least 2 people raised their hands asking the same question. So the question was, okay, this is a great session, very engaging, but we've only been talking about personal level action. What do we do here as an organization?
Yeah.
In my head, I was like, yes.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the reason why we chose our target group, people and organizations. We recognize people, individuals have tremendous amount of power, but also organizations are units of this micro units of resilience. And there's a lot organizations can do to be empowered to take action. So coming back to your question, what process we use, or what type of language we use. So one language we've developed is called Keep Calm and Use MAP, M-A-P. Keep Calm and Use MAP. And MAP stands for Mind the Change, Accept the Transition, and Prepare to Adapt. And in Dutch, the Dutch version is Blijf kalm en gebruik lab. And just happens the acronym is LAB, which means use lab, which also works out quite well. but yeah, so we use this type of language, and so as you can see, it's sort of where we're borrowing from the British wisdom there, and it's a common language that everyone sort of recognize, and also map. We're coming in from a level of let's figure out. So first off, what is climate change? What does that mean from your perspective? So we do care about what people think of climate change, and this is risky because we want to present the facts, right? Scientific facts. But as you know, we know not everyone, unfortunately, not everyone subscribe to the scientific facts just yet. So we do get the occasional people asking, you know, is this really human induced? But then we address that right away using facts. And I think that's a nice way of consolidating our understanding and bring up to the same page, right? Meet them where they are and pull them along. You know, do that, giving them a chance to say this without feeling that they're left out. And the accept the transition, energy transition, to talk about what they do individually or as an organization. So there's a sense of empowerment, because talking about climate change can be pretty heavy. And then finally, talking about adaptation activities, further empowerment. What can they take into their own hands to prepare for extreme weather conditions or basically disruptions or unwanted effects from disasters. So those, and in ways that is relevant for the participants.
Right. Would you repeat for me the M part of MAP?
Mind the change. So that's a bit of a wordplay because we're just like the British, again, British wisdom. I think that's the underground tube,
Right.
mind the gap, but we say mind the change. It's more than just be mindful of the change, but also mind what's in your mind that change is. Because for me, that has a different degree of mindfulness or awareness. This is actually quite personal for me because the journey with Deep Adaptation started when I came home one day from my work and saw photos of a friend's house that was being renovated for 2 years already at that time. And it was, I think, September 15th in 2018, I guess. It was just, their house was flooded after a heavy downpour that the meteorological department did not manage to predict. And this is Netherlands. We're very proud of the water management here.
Right.
So for that to happen, it was climate change in my face, not just on the computer in a laptop screen here. Sorry, I'm pointing my hands here, but not just that there, it's right in my face, under my nose. And I think mind the change was, that was a moment for me to mind the change and realize there's work that we can do here in the Netherlands. So,
got it.
Yeah.
You know, in your layout, which thank you for giving us that kind of layout of the basics of some of your work with people. And I especially can absolutely appreciate the orientation to want to meet people where they are. If there's one kind of handy hint for successful communication with people in these polarized times, not just about climate change, it's to meet people where they are. So I think there's immense wisdom with you and your team having put that right there at the foundation of what you do. My hat's off to you there.
Thank you.
I'm a little curious about, it's unfair for me to ask this, but I'm wondering if you could just find an example or two somewhere around the middle of the average audience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, how aware are people, and what sort of things, when you hear them speak, what sort of things are they seeing on their own horizon from their own understanding of what's going on? What does this stuff mean? Like, is it all 2100? Is it all somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere? Or is it sooner? And is it far more personal and more local these days?
That's what you're asking is part of the reason why I love my job so much right now.
All right.
The opportunity to talk to what you call the general public, people that I would not interact with, and just outside the climate change bubble, so to speak. What is going on? I'll give you a couple of examples, and I think the short answer is it really varies. The range of understanding and perception really varies, but I'll tell you a couple of things that surprised me. One was in a conversation with, again, organization. We're talking about the effects of extreme storm here in Netherlands, and that's going to be increasingly more frequent and heavier. Right, that's how it is getting. And one of the directors surprisingly got very personal. He's just like, I live in this area, which happens to be also one of the risky area. I'm gonna have to go home to look at what we can do. Mm-hmm. And that to me was where science, the facts, because the number is 25, like the prediction is by 2050, it will be 25% worse. Mm-hmm. And that's a big number, because as you, for building design codes and all that, because you're only building to a certain threshold, but even if, one drop over that threshold, that's too much. Yeah. So for people to react right away, there and then, that was a positive feeling that would call people into action. And the other one was at another event at a municipality, and one of the ladies who works for, so this is sort of what the municipality department trying to mainstream this topic by inviting people who wants to discuss this from different departments. And one lady, she came from event management. Right, so they're the one gives permit working with different organizations who request permit. And when we were talking about the droughts and heat waves and the impacts here in Netherlands, one thing she mentioned, she shared with the group was that, hey, I'm thinking which partners I need to work with to bring awareness to this. Is there work we need to think ahead of time to prepare for those extreme events, so that the communication would happen quicker as opposed to being passively. So I thought that was brilliant. It's about connecting the dots. I think what I noticed, people are quite intelligent. Once you present the dots to them, they can draw the lines in between. And the other one I will mention is just this Monday, we had a pitch on our game day at a event organization company. So it is a company. And I wasn't there. Two of my colleagues were there. And in the debrief, we heard from them was that they, as part of so we ran through the whole game day experience, not just playing the board game, but also post-game discussion. What can you do? And I was really pleasantly surprised and pleased to hear that they're looking at this year to calculate their carbon footprint of their activities. and looking at harvesting some of the energies from, because they work with beach type of activities. Are there ways to harvest the energy, for example? So I thought those are very concrete actions that's relevant for their organizations, for the company. So I think I don't know if I answer your questions. Maybe Netherlands, but mind you, I do want to give like credit to the Dutch culture or population as well. We're a lot more comfortable to discuss risk in this country. And if anything, I think here people are more aware of sea level rising. I mean, people are already dealing with seawater. We have a dike that's 17 kilometers long to manage the seawater surge. So there's a lot more. So maybe I'm quite lucky. My colleagues and I were very lucky that we're working with the Dutch. For now, our primary target group is in the Netherlands. So we're quite lucky in that sense. But I would say by and large, people are aware that is happening. But the dots people are not connecting is that is happening here. It could happen where they are, where they work. You know, that's the personal relevant dot that a lot of participants weren't able to connect just yet. But having this platform facilitate that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. You did answer my question, and I appreciate it. I still have a very difficult time looking back to my time in corporate or organizational work and delivering this type of material and facilitating this type of material as you do. It's very difficult for me to imagine myself in your shoes. It's even though you bring fun, and I have no question that it's great in your classes, it's still tough. You know, we're still talking about the most difficult conversation in human history. It's very difficult, even in a primarily denial-based environment like much of the USA, Australia, and so on. It's still seems to me that people know, even in the denier community, they know that things are happening.
Right.
And so I guess what I'm doing is indirectly acknowledging you and your team for taking on an extraordinarily difficult conversation and to do it in a way that creates rapport and really honors people. Excuse me for some noise here. I'm gonna.
No worries. No problem. I mean, I can speak to the experience of challenging conversation.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Like
that'd be just fine.
Yes, I think it's true. The conversations can be challenging at times. I had, in one of the community dialogue days, we had this 80-year-old lady who asked me in Dutch, do you really believe everything the government is telling you? You know, is it really us that's causing all this? And I think, so it was clear to me that her talking about meeting people where they are, her position was obviously heavily influenced by the skepticism and the deniers, their messaging. And even my Dutch teacher, when I showed up to get some Dutch lessons, she proudly showed me this magazine with an article on climate change, and it's like, look, you should read this for your Dutch. And I started reading it, and a couple lines later, I realized it's written by a climate denier. So I was like, I'm not sure if this is really helping my Dutch, but okay. So it is loud. the noise is loud. And that's because there's so much carbon. So this is digressing a little bit, but there's a lot of wealth associated with carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm personally very aware of that, but that's not the reason for us to stop having those conversations. Because I see this as almost like a, what do you call it, the hourglass. We've had a lot of carbon sand wealth on the bottom. If we try to tilt it forward, you still have to give it time for the sand to seep through to the other side, which is the side accepting that climate change is human induced, and we can do a lot more to reduce the negative impact, and we also need to do a whole lot more to manage the effects. So, but the bottom line is, it does take time. It's challenging conversations, but without providing that little narrow bottleneck or make it wider, having that platform for people to transition their mind,
Mm-hmm.
we will always be struggling to flip the hourglass back and forth.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making any sense, but yeah, it is challenging. But this is why we sign up for it. Actually, now is a good time to mention my conversation with Professor Bender, or we call him Jem, sorry. When I met Jem the first time, and he forgot this completely, by the way. I mean, just because he met so many people, I totally understand. But when I mentioned the idea about Deep Adaptation, we meet people where they are and trying to introduce positivity in the conversation, I think that was also like a Saturday early morning, and he didn't even have his first cup of coffee yet. But he was just looking at me. He's like, "So, what are you doing? Like, that's so different from people who have been doing this for decades. How is this gonna work?" And I felt sort of, questioning my own philosophy as well. How do I know this will work, or what does it mean to work? And it's true, we are struggling. It's decades, right? Decades of effort in communicating this, and we're still dealing with a lot of deniers and skeptics. One way to approach this is to, I guess what we're doing is to accept that they do exist, but still try to engage them, or anyone. We're not isolating them. We're actually being inclusive. Anyone who wants to be there, let's have people to share their thoughts, and hopefully the sand will seep through the hourglass and make the communication broader as well.
Mm.
I'm holding my fingers crossed.
Right. Well, it's very interesting that you happen to share that piece of your story with Jem. I have quite, by what seems like accident, stumbled into being a part of a strategy group at the center of the Deep Adaptation community, particularly the Facebook group and the forum and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And their task, our task, is to facilitate the gathering of information, the gathering of opinion and experience from the community, and to formulate really a core to what is deep adaptation as an organizational expression in the world. And so the question I've been asking myself before we've really gotten into the depth of these meetings, these strategy meetings, is how will this be different? How will the offerings of deep adaptation be different than, let's just take an example right out of the center of primarily what Katie Carr brought into the design and delivery of the deep adaptation workshop that you and I first started talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And and really my question, as I've been leading Q&A conversations with
Yeah.
people directly related to Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects, one of those conversations just a couple of months ago was with Molly Young Brown, with whom Joanna Macy wrote the most recent edition of Coming Back to Life, their open source manual for the work that reconnects. And also a recent conversation with, I can remember his, Chris Johnstone, with whom Joanna Macy wrote Active Hope. And they are also writing a second edition to that book.
Yep.
Those are two seminal cornerstone books for people who are involved in this kind of conversation. And I've been wondering what sets this supposed distinction of deep adaptation apart from, let's call it Transition Town, or the work that reconnects, or even the work of circling. It's going to be very interesting to see what we come up with, where we finally land. So I appreciate what Jem asked you is very similar to what I'm asking about the Center of Deep Adaptation.
Yes.
And again, just to show you my hand in full disclosure, I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned that as powerful, as beautiful, and as brilliant as the work that reconnects is, it's been going on for close to 40 years now. And while I know that it has made something of a difference for myself personally, and something of a difference for the many people who've done it,
right,
in terms of actual change in the world, especially at the level of, at the time, nuclear weapons technology was the biggest of concerns back at the beginning time.
Right.
And now we've got something even larger, and we have even more concern about nuclear weapons now than we did then.
Yes.
I guess what I'm just offering to you, and I don't mean to end us on sort of a dark note, but I do want to explore just a little bit in a kind of a sober end of the conversation, and really on a more personal note, because I really get your work thrives at the level that you've been describing to us, meeting people where they are and bringing positive change and bringing even humor to it. Yay. So if we could shift gears to our more personal experience, which we got to share a bit in the workshop last June. I guess I'm showing you my hand first. And my hand is, I'm not particularly hopeful. In fact, if for those who know my work off my website, I'm now offering individual standalone learning series about certain aspects of this whole conversation of human-caused collapse. And this one I'm speaking about right now is about hope.
Right.
And actually, it ends by really pointing out that how most of us put together the word hope is extraordinarily disempowering and not at all helpful. But that's a whole nother story. If I could just go to the usual definition of hope, I'm not very hopeful right now that what I'm seeing, even in this remarkable kind of new bubbling up community of deep adaptation folk, I'm not seeing how this is going to bring about transformation. Which incremental change is cool, but we've had 30 years in which to do anything incremental, and we've done nothing but worsen our condition. So that's me showing you my hand. I'm grappling with that. I am developing a very full toolkit for self-regulation and co-regulation. I'm offering that to others to find a way to stay open-hearted, intentionally and lovingly open-hearted, even in the face of this kind of sober reality, if you will.
Right.
I'm curious, is there any part of what you're looking out and seeing in the world that is heavy on your heart, that really takes some work to keep it clear for you and keep you able to move into the next day and the next?
Okay. So the parts that what you're speaking to, definitely there are moments where I feel that the heaviness of the amount of change that needs to be brought about, and the pace we're moving. I mean, that's indisputable. Even with some of the recent news, we're looking at COP25 output, and that the projection of transition were way off the chart in terms of how the energy transition. Yes, I think there are moments where I look at those news and wondering which it's like driving around that curve, right? So are we going to be, how close are we going to be? Are we hitting some unknown obstacles? What's going to happen with all the unexpected events that we cannot predict? There are definitely those moments, but I think for me, my work in particularly with both Deep Adaptation and also Deep Adaptation, I definitely see more and more people getting involved in a way that's meaningful. And I feel like there's a threshold, right? So we cannot talk about transformation collapse without talking about transformation. Because collapse is a transform of a form. And out comes a new form, and that is transformation. So, and there's already momentum building. And just the other day, I was talking to someone who works at an old industrial ship that was converted into a sustainable, equal, I guess, village or building. They have their own microcurrency in trading energy. Fantastic. I mean, these are not just these are the ultimate resilience building, and because we talked about financial system, remember that's part of the deep adaptation discussion.
Yeah,
it's already happening in places. So I think there's almost like we choose. There's so much to see in the climate change action domain. We can choose to look at what we want to look at. And I'm really consciously self-regulating myself to look at both. So even though the curve is not as, we're not hitting the targets as we want to, but it is following some sort of curve. The transition is happening, but it's the challenge of pace we're dealing with. And that's where I feel that, I definitely embrace the deep adaptation, the sort of more, let's say, holistic take on this, more of a philosophical approach on this with Joanna Macy's book. It's very inspiring. But for a lot of people, maybe they're not there yet, right? So they're making changes in their own way. Just because someone is not reading that book does not mean they're not already thinking about those things and making those transitions. Right. So I try to self-regulate to find light in the darkness. And somewhere in between, there lies hope.
Yeah. Well, Shu, it seems like the energy and the time envelope of our conversation is drawing to a close, and I'm really struck by you really are built for what you're doing. You know, you have such a remarkable disposition. You have, as I said at the beginning, just a contagious enthusiasm.
Thank you.
And that's a precious, precious thing that unfortunately doesn't show up on resumes nearly enough. You know, HR is not looking for that nearly as much as they should be. And especially with the kind of sober backbone that you have as well. This is not a what's sometimes called hopium veneer over someone. This is your, you know, I've been around you enough now to know this is who you are. And I know that behind the scenes, you are sincerely grappling with the harder parts of the conversation. And I thank you for sharing a little bit of that with us today. Is there I have two questions for you.
And I have something I want to say as well.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Well, why don't you start with what you want to say?
So thank you so much for saying what you just said. I'm thinking now maybe I should do more podcasts. Since if it doesn't show on CV, hey, podcast works pretty well. So thanks for the opportunity, really, Dean. Like I mentioned, this is my first time, and hey, I'm really enjoying chatting with you. And who knows who might hear the podcast, which is why I definitely should mention, because I promised my colleagues that I would mention or do a shameless plug of our website.
Yes, absolutely.
Encourage people to well, just share your thoughts, really. We're new and we're growing, and we can use a lot more feedback and voices, support. Our website is DAYAD, so day and then .org. It's a palindrome as well, DAYAD, so it spells same forward and backwards. See, I'm a nerd, so I really like that aspect. So yeah, that's our website, and on the website there are also little film on our board game. It's called Minions of Disruptions. We're taking a bit of a risky approach, but fun approach in how we narrate the climate change. So we're introducing these minion creatures. Do you know minions?
Oh yeah.
You look like a Disney guy.
Okay.
So these minions are basically disrupting the way we live and work by emission. One is called carbon, right? Carbon. And the other one is called climate. They're disrupting our ways of living and working. And then you have zillions. The resilience wants to be there to if the players choose to exercise their measures to activate the zillions to win against climate disruptions. I personally love the game because I'm a nerd. And people, when they play, they do get the gist of the complexity, and you see the interaction between people as well, the human factor, right? At the end of the day, we're working with people. The collaboration, the competition. So that's quite a lot of fun. So I just want to mention that and invite feedback and discussion.
Very good. I will be sure to put all that information in the show notes underneath this episode. And you, of course, will have full access to download this whole interview and post it on your site or in whatever way serves you. So
thank you.
Yeah, I'm a shameless promoter of people who are trying to make a difference in this world. It's absolutely an easy and good thing to do. Well, that was one of my questions.
Oh,
and
yay!
And here's the last one. Is if you had just a minute to suggest to folks who would position themselves in one of those organizations, just folks who don't know a whole lot about what's going on, but they do know enough to know that there's important stuff going on, and they want to know how they can fit in, how they can make a difference, perhaps how their own organization or family or neighborhood can make a difference.
Right.
Do you have a few words to share with people who might be sort of new to this, bridging into this reality?
So I think you're talking about particularly those who have ideas but haven't really taken on any tangible actions, or right? Is that what you're addressing to? Okay.
Yeah.
I would say this is one thing I learned from the journey. A lot of the case you're describing is actually quite prominent. There are a lot of people who are in that position. Finding a platform, a channel to discuss with others who may share your concern, that's a wonderful starting point, because there's power in sharing vulnerability, because at the end of the day is risk, which is a fancy term for vulnerability. And that's could be actually vulnerability. Sorry, this is my nerdy side. Risk is vulnerability and probability, but okay, I'll take that away. Probability away, but it's vulnerability. And there's a lot of strength in discovering vulnerability with those who are close to you, whether you're in, so this is the unit of organization or community or family or friends, to find channels to discuss that openly, not just have it here, but truly express that. Yeah. Maybe that's why we're doing what we're doing. At the end of the day, we've just said so much. You can only sit so much and think so much to yourself, right?
Yep.
And do so much research and read so much paper. At the end of the day, it's about what does it mean for you and I, where we live, where we work. It might be confusing, might be challenging, but it's very rewarding, and it certainly provides that clarity that we all want to have.
Yeah. Shu Liang, it is an absolute pleasure to have met you last June, to stay connected with you in the periphery of each other's lives and all that we're up to. I send the warmest blessings to you and your team for incredible growth and success, and for people to value greatly the teachings that you bring, the experience that you bring to every organization. And thank you so much for also sharing the more personal side of how you are facing into this daunting future that we've got ahead of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Dean, thanks for the opportunity, if I may say so.
Yeah.
Huge shout out to everyone that I've met through this journey. And that's the team that we have at Deep Adaptation, as well as Deep Adaptation. Just everyone has, if anything, the common thread is everyone has been very much encouraging and inspiring to make this collective impact that we set out to do. And that in itself is extremely rewarding. I mean, we have the dream jobs in a way. I mean, if this is, it's nourishing, isn't it?
Yes, I find that as well.
So thank you for the opportunity.
Take good care of yourself.
We'll see you next time then.
Indeed.
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.